Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading The Hiding Place, and I'm on chapter 14, The Blue Sweater, a little bit less than halfway through. Corrie had been talking about the dream that Betsie had about a big house where they would take care of people in the concentration camp, and Corrie just thinks that's quite a contrast to their reality, which was Ravensbrück. This is page 223 in my book. But it wasn't a dream. It was really achingly, endlessly true, and it was always during roll calls that the accumulated misery threatened to overwhelm me. One morning, 3 women from Barracks 28 lingered inside a few minutes to avoid the cold. All the following week, the entire barracks was punished by an extra hour of attention. The lights on the Langenstrasse were not even lit when we were driven from our bunks at 3:30 a.m. It was during this pre-inspection lineup one morning that I saw what I had till then refused to believe. Headlights appeared at the far end of the long street, wavering over the snow. Trucks with open flatbeds in the rear were approaching, spattering slush as they passed. They pulled up at the front door of the hospital. The door opened and a nurse appeared, supporting an old woman whose legs buckled as she limped down the steps. The nurse lifted her gently onto the back of the truck. They were pouring out the door now, leaning on the arms of nurses and hospital helpers, the old, the ill. Last of all came the orderlies with stretchers between them. Our eyes took in every detail of the scene. Our brains refused. We had known, of course, that when overcrowding reached a certain point, the sickest were taken to the brick building at the foot of the great square smokestack. But that these women here in front of us, these very ones, it was not possible. Above all, I could not put it together with the kindly behavior of the nurses. That one in the truck just ahead, bending solicitously, even tenderly over her patient. What was passing through her mind just now? And all the while it grew colder. One night during evening roll call, a platoon somewhere down the Lagerstrasse began a rhythmic stamping. The sound grew as others picked it up. The guards did not stop us, and at last the entire street was marching in place, pounding tattered shoes against the frozen ground, driving circulation back into numb feet and legs. From now on, this was the sound of roll call, the stamping of thousands of feet in this long, dark street. And as the cold increased, so did the special temptation of concentration camp life, the temptation to think only of oneself. It took 1,000 cunning forms. I quickly discovered that when I maneuvered our way toward the middle of the roll call formation, we had a little protection from the wind. I knew this was self-centered when Betsie and I stood in the center. Someone else had to stand on the edge. How easy it was to give it other names. I was acting only for Betsie's sake. We were an important ministry and must keep well. Well, it was colder in Poland than in Holland. These Polish women probably were not feeling the chill the way we were. Those are all the excuses that she was using for standing in the middle. Selfishness had a life of its own. As I watched Mian's bag of yeast compound disappear, I began taking it from beneath the straw only after lights out, when others would not see and ask for some. Wasn't Betsie's health more important? You see, God, she can do so much for them. Remember that house after the war? But even if it wasn't right, it wasn't so very wrong, was it? Not wrong like sadism and murder and other monstrous evils we saw in Ravensbrück every day. Oh, this was the great ploy of Satan in that kingdom of his, to display such blatant evil that one could almost believe one's own secret sins didn't matter. The cancer spread. The second week in December, every occupant of Barracks 28 was issued an extra blanket. The next day, a large group of evacuees arrived from Czechoslovakia. One of them, assigned to our platform, had no blanket at all. Betsie insisted that we give her one of ours. So that evening, I lent a blanket, but I didn't give it to her. In my heart, I held on to the right to own that blanket. Was it coincidence that joy and power imperceptibly drained from my ministry? My prayers took on a mechanical ring. Even Bible reading was dull and lifeless. Betsie tried to take over for me, but her cough made reading aloud impossible. And so I struggled on with worship and teaching that had ceased to be real, until one drizzly, raw afternoon, when just enough light came through the window to read by, I came to Paul's account of his thorn in the flesh. 3 times he said he had begged God to take away his weakness, whatever it was, and each time God had said, "Rely on me." At last, Paul concluded, the words seemed to leap from the page, that his very weakness was something to give thanks for, because now Paul knew that none of the wonders and miracles that followed his ministry could be due to his own virtues. It was all Christ's strength, never Paul's. And there it was. The truth blazed like sunlight in the shadows of Barracks 28. The real sin I had been committing was not that of inching toward the center of a platoon because I was cold. The real sin lay in thinking that any power to help and transform came from us. Of course, it was not my wholeness, but Christ that made the difference. The short winter day was fading. I could no longer separate the words on the page, and so I closed the Bible. And to that group of women clustering close, I told the truth about myself, my self-centeredness, my stinginess, my lack of love. That night, real joy returned to my worship. Each roll call, the wind seemed sharper. Whenever she could, Mean smuggled newspapers from the staff room at the hospital, which we placed inside our clothes. Nolly's blue sweater beneath Betsie's dress was black with newsprint. The cold seemed to be affecting Betsie's legs. Sometimes in the morning she could not move them at all, and 2 of us would have to carry her between us. It was not hard. She weighed no more than a child, but she could no longer stamp her feet as the rest of us did to keep the blood flowing. When we returned to the dormitory, I would rub her feet and hands, but my own only picked up the chill from hers. It was the week before Christmas that Betsie woke up unable to move either legs or arms. I shoved my way through the crowded aisles to the center room. The snake was on duty. "Please," I begged, "Betsie is ill. Oh, please, she's got to go to the hospital." "Stand at attention and state your number." "Prisoner 66730 reporting. Please, my sister is sick." "All prisoners must report for the count. If she's sick, she can register at sick call." Marieke de Graaf, a Dutch woman on the tier above ours, helped me form a cradle with our arms and carry Betsie outside. The rhythmic stamping had already begun in the Lagerstrasse. We carried her to the hospital, then stopped. In the light of the street lamps, the sick call line stretched to the edge of the building and out of sight around the corner. In the sooty snow alongside, 3 bodies lay where they had fallen. Without a word, Marieke and I turned, carried our load back to the Lagerstrasse. After roll call, we got her back into bed. Her speech was slow and blurred, but she was trying to say something. "A camp, Corrie, a concentration camp. But we're in charge." I had been very close to hear. The camp was in Germany. It was no longer a prison, but a home where people who had been warped by this philosophy and hate and force could come to learn another way. There were no walls, no barbed wire, and the barracks had window boxes. It will be so good for them, watching things grow. People can learn to love from flowers. I knew by now which people she meant. The German people. I thought of the snake standing in the barracks door that morning. "State your number. All prisoners must report for the count." I looked into Betsie's shrunken face. "We are to have this camp in Germany instead, Betsie. Instead of the big house in Holland." "Oh, no," she seemed shocked. "You know, we have the house first. It's ready and waiting for us. Such tall, tall windows. The sun is streaming in." A coughing fit seized her when finally she lay still. A stain of blood blackened the straw. She dozed fitfully during the day and night that followed, waking several times with the excitement of some new detail about our work in Holland or Germany. "The barracks are gray, Corrie, but we'll paint them green, bright, light green, like springtime." "We'll be together, Betsie. We'll be doing all this together. You're sure about that?" "Always together, Corrie. You and I, always together." When the siren blew next morning, Mary Kay and I again carried Betsie from the dormitory. The snake was standing in the street door. As we started through it with our fragile burden, she stepped in front of us. "Take her back to the bunks." "I thought all I said take her back." Wonderingly, we replaced Betsie on the bed. Sleet rattled against the windows. Was it possible that the atmosphere of Barracks 28 had affected even this cruel guard? As soon as roll call was dismissed, I ran back to the dormitory. There, beside our bed, stood the snake. Beside her, 2 orderlies from the hospital were setting down a stretcher. The snake straightened almost guiltily as I approached. "Prisoner is ready for transfer," she snapped. I looked at the woman more closely. Had she risked fleas and lice to spare Betsie the sick call line? She did not stop me as I started after the stretcher. Our group of knitters was just entering the big room. As we passed, a Polish friend dropped to her knees and made the sign of the cross. Sleet stung us as we reached the outside. I stepped close to the stretcher to form a shield for Betsie. We walked past the waiting line of sick people, through the door, and into a large ward. They placed the stretcher on the floor, and I leaned down to make out Betsie's words. "Must tell people what we have learned here. We must tell them there is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still. They will listen to us, Corrie, because we have been here." I stared at her wasted form. "But when will all this happen, Betsie?" "Now. Right away. Oh, very soon, by the 1st of the year, Corrie. We will be out of prison." A nurse had caught sight of me. I backed to the door of the room and watched as they placed Betsie on a narrow cot close to the window. I ran around to the outside of the building. At last, Betsie caught sight of me. We exchanged smiles and soundless words until one of the camp police shouted at me to move along. About noontime, I put down my knitting and went out to the center room. "Prisoner 66730 reporting. Request permission to visit the hospital." I stood ramrod straight. The snake glanced up, then scrawled out a pass. Outside, it was still sleeting. I reached the door of the ward, but the horrible nurse would not let me enter, even with my pass. So I went again to the window next to Betsie's cot. I waited until the nurse left the room, then tapped gently. Betsie's eyes opened. She turned her head. "Are you all right?" I formed with my lips. She nodded. "You must get a good rest," I went on. She moved her lips in reply, but I could not follow. She formed the words again. I bent my head to one side, level with hers, the blue lips open again. "So much work to do." The snake was off duty during the afternoon and evening, and though I asked other guards repeatedly, I did not again get permission to leave. The minute roll call was dismissed the following morning, I headed for the hospital, permission or no. I reached the window, cut my eyes to peer in. A nurse was standing directly between me and Betsie. I ducked out of sight, waited a minute, then looked again. A second nurse had joined the first. both now standing where I wanted to see. They stepped to the head and foot of the bed. I gazed curiously at what lay on it. It was a carving in old yellow ivory. There was no clothing on the figure. I could see each ivory rib and the outline of the teeth through the parchment cheeks. It took me a moment to realize it was Betsie. The nurses had each seized 2 corners of the sheet. They lifted it between them and carried the bundle from the room before my heart had started to beat again in my chest. Betsie, but she had so much to do. She could not. Where were they taking her? Where had they gone? I turned from the window and began running along the side of the building, chest hurting as I breathed. Then I remembered the washroom. That window at the rear. That was where... My feet carried me mechanically round to the back of the building, and there, with my hand on the windowsill, I stopped. Suppose she was there. Suppose they laid Betsie on that floor. I started walking again. I walked for a long time, still with that pain in my chest, and each time my feet took me back to the washroom window. I would not go in. I would not look. Betsie could not be there. I walked some more. Strangely enough, though, I passed several camp police. No one stopped or questioned me. Corrie! I turned around to see Mean running after me. Corrie, I've looked for you everywhere. Oh, Corrie, come. She seized my arm, drew me toward the back of the hospital. When I saw where she was headed, I wrenched my arm free. I know, Mean. I know already. She didn't seem to hear. She seized me again, led me to the washroom window, pushed me ahead of her. In the reeking room stood a nurse. I drew back in alarm, but Mean was behind me. This is the sister, Mean said to the nurse. I turned my head to the side. I would not look at the bodies that lined the far wall. Mean put an arm around my shoulder and drew me across the room till we were standing above that heartbreaking row. Corrie, do you see her? I raised my eyes to Betsie's face. Lord Jesus, what have you done? Oh, Lord, what are you saying? What are you giving me? For there lay Betsie, her eyes closed as if in sleep, her face full and young. The care lines, the grief lines, the deep hollows of hunger and disease were simply gone. In front of me was the Betsie of Harlem, happy and at peace, stronger, freer. This was Betsie of heaven, bursting with joy and health. Even her hair was graciously in place as if an angel had ministered to her. At last I turned wonderingly to Mean. The nurse went silently to the door, opened it for us herself. You can leave through the hall, she said softly. I looked once more at the radiant face of my sister. Then Mean and I left the room together. A pile of clothes was heaped outside in the hallway. On top lay Nolly's blue sweater. I stopped to pick it up. The sweater was threadbare and stained with newsprint, but it was a tangible link with Betsie. Mean seized my arm. Don't touch those things. Black lice. They'll all be burned. And so I left behind the last physical tie. It was just as well, it was better. Now what tied me to Betsie was the hope of heaven. Okay, there's still 1.5 more chapters left in the book, but I would consider this the climax, the high point of the book, where everything in the book was building for this dramatic moment that Betsie would die in the concentration camp, and yet somehow she was miraculously transformed in her death to look like she had seen heaven. Bye-bye.